The HOA demolished my ugly dam, the very same one my late brother and I built to protect the valley. The HOA president, Karen, stood there with a smirk, waving forged permits as bulldozers tore down decades of my family's work. She had an off-duty sheriff flashing a bogus court order, thinking she had committed the perfect crime. But while she was celebrating her victory, she forgot one tiny thing. The rainiest season in 15 years was on its way. What do you do when the law is on their side, but gravity is on yours? Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, because you are not going to believe what my hidden cameras caught next. It was a Tuesday in mid-April when my world tilted. The morning started like any other. I was up before the sun, coffee in hand, watching the fog burn off the small lake my dam had created 50 years ago. My brother Michael and I built that dam with our own hands, stone by stone. After buying this acreage, it wasn't just a pile of rocks and earth. It was a promise to the land, a promise to each other. Now with Michael gone 10 years, it was a memorial that happened to also keep my small orchard watered and the downhill properties from turning into a swamp every time it rained hard. I did my usual walk down the long gravel drive to get the newspaper. That's when I saw it, taped to my front gate. Inside a waterproof plastic sleeve was a certified letter. The green tab was like a poison dart. You know the kind. Nothing good ever comes in a certified letter. My heart, a steady old pump that had seen 72 years of life, kicked a little harder. This wasn't a flyer for a new pizza place. This was official. This was trouble. I took it back to the kitchen, slid the envelope open with a butter knife, and unfolded the single sheet of paper. It was from the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. The letter was dated April 14th, stamped at 10:32 a.m. I read the words, and a cold anger started to simmer in my gut. It said, "My dam, a structure that stood on my land 100 feet from their precious community, was in violation of aesthetic standards." It called my brother's life's work an ugly eyesore. It claimed it was an unauthorized structure that had to be demolished within 30 days at my expense, or they would do it for me and put a lien on my property. My property. I walked over to the old filing cabinet where I keep the important papers, deeds, titles, wills. I pulled out the original survey map, the one with the county seal from 1968. I spread it out on the table, the brittle paper crinkling under my fingers. The line was clear as day. My property started well before the dam. The dam, the creek, and the small lake behind it were mine. They had no more legal right to touch it. Then they had to repaint my house. I thought, this is a mistake. A simple, stupid mistake made by someone who can't read a map. I'd go to the next board meeting and clear it all up. The HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room that smelled of air freshener and weak coffee. I sat in the back, my survey map rolled up in my hand like a baton. The board members sat at a long folding table, looking self-important. In the center was the president, Karen Whitfield. She was a woman who wore control like a tailored suit. Everything about her was sharp. Her haircut, her blazer, the little gavel she tapped on the table to demand silence. When the floor opened for public comment, I stood up. I kept my voice calm and even. I'm an engineer by trade, and we're taught to rely on facts, not feelings. I introduced myself, stated my address, and unrolled the survey map on an empty chair for everyone to see. I explained that their letter was based on a factual error. The dam was on my private land, not HOA common area. I pointed to the thick black line on the map. "This is the property line," I said. "The dam is here. It's not yours to touch." For a moment, I thought reason had a fighting chance. Karen's polite smile faltered, but before she could respond, a woman a few rows ahead of me, Linda Garvey, turned around. She lived in one of the $1 million homes at the bottom of the hill. "Frank's right," she said, her voice clear and certain. "I've lived here 12 years. Every time we get a gully washer of a storm, the water comes down that hill, but it never floods our street. That dam's why my basement never floods." A hush fell over the room. A few other residents nodded in agreement. A retired Army colonel who lived next to Linda muttered, "She's right about that." I felt a wave of relief. This was how communities were supposed to work, neighbors listening to each other. Applying a little common sense, I thought the matter was settled. But I had completely underestimated Karen Whitfield's thirst for power. She let the silence hang for a beat, her eyes scanning the room, taking note of who nodded, who spoke up. Then her smile snapped back into place. But this time, it was all teeth. "Thank you for your input, Mr. Delaney," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "However, the board has already consulted with experts." She held up a sheath of papers. "We have certified inspection reports and county approval for the removal." She fanned the pages out. At the top of one was what looked like a county permit, but from 20 feet away, even I could tell something was wrong. The stamp, the official seal, it was fuzzy, like it had been photocopied and enlarged. It didn't have the crisp, embossed feel of a real county document. My engineer's mind screamed forgery, but I had no way to prove it. Not right then. She was lying, and she was doing it in front of 24 people. She looked right at me and said, "The structure is an insurance liability and an eyesore. Demolition is scheduled to proceed." She tapped her gavel. Next item on the agenda. I was dismissed. Just like that. The facts didn't matter. The survey map didn't matter. The safety of her own neighbors didn't matter. All that mattered was that she had found something she wanted to control, and she was going to tear it down. Truth be damned. I walked out of that clubhouse into the cool night air, the ridiculous letter clutched in my hand. This was no longer about a mistake. This was a declaration of war. The day they came for the dam was Maywand. I remember the exact time, 7:15 in the morning, because the ground started to vibrate just as I was pouring my second cup of coffee. It was a low, deep rumble that wasn't thunder. It was the sound of diesel engines, and it was close, too close. I went to the front window and saw it. Lined up on the road outside my gate were two massive yellow bulldozers and a flatbed truck. Standing in front of them, clipboard in hand, was Karen Whitfield. She was dressed in a sharp blazer, looking like a general commanding her troops. My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. I had hoped her threat at the meeting was just bluster. I was wrong. She was actually going to do it. I grabbed my phone, hit the record button, and walked outside. The morning air was cool, but the scene was hot with aggression. Karen saw me coming, and a tight, satisfied smile spread across her face. Next to her stood a man in a sheriff's deputy uniform, Deputy Rick Nolan. He worked for the county, but everyone knew he took side jobs doing security for the HOA. He was Karen's muscle. He held a piece of paper, waving it at me as I approached the gate. "Mr. Delaney," he said, his voice trying to sound official but failing to hide a slight waver. "I have a court order here for the removal of the unapproved structure on this property." He held it up for me to see. I zoomed in with my phone's camera. It was a flimsy document full of legal-sounding words, but my eyes went straight to the fine print at the bottom, the parcel number. It was for Lot 140B. My property was Lot 112A. They had a court order for the wrong piece of land. "Deputy," I said, keeping my voice as steady as a concrete pillar, "you might want to read that document a little more closely. That parcel number isn't for this property. You're at the wrong address." He glanced down at the paper, his confidence faltering for a split second. Karen stepped forward, snatching the paper from his hand. "It's a clerical error, a typo," she snapped, not even looking at it. "The order is for the illegal dam. Everyone knows which dam that is. Now stand aside." I didn't move. I kept my phone steady, recording her face, the deputy's uneasy expression, the heavy equipment idling behind them. This was my evidence. At 4:30 that morning, unable to sleep, I had sent one final email to every member of the HOA board. The subject line was clear. Final warning, geotechnical report on dam removal. I attached two separate engineering reports from the 80s detailing how the dam stabilized the entire ravine and managed storm runoff. I wrote in simple terms that removing it would cause catastrophic soil erosion and predictable downstream flooding. I got no reply. The email was time-stamped 4:33 a.m. Now I was making sure the demolition was time-stamped too. Neighbors started to trickle out of their homes. Some of Karen's friends from the board were there, a little cheering squad, whispering and pointing at me, but others looked worried. Linda Garvey stood on her porch, her hand over her mouth. A few houses down, a quiet old veteran named Gus, who fought in Vietnam, was watching from his driveway. He shook his head slowly and muttered something to his wife. I was too far away to hear it all, but I caught the last part clearly. "They'll regret this." Karen gave a sharp nod to the contractors. One of them climbed into the cab of the first bulldozer. The engine roared to life. Deputy Nolan unlocked my gate and swung it open. He wouldn't look me in the eye. I stood my ground just outside the path of the machine, my phone still recording. "Sir, for the last time, you need to move," the deputy said. I didn't. This was my land. That was my dam, my brother's memory. I wasn't going to make it easy for them. The contractor honked the horn. Karen shouted, "Just get it done." The bulldozer lurched forward, its huge metal tracks chewing up my gravel driveway. I finally stepped aside, not for them, but to get a better angle with my camera. The machine lumbered past me, heading down the path toward the water. It was a horrifying sight, a mechanical monster about to destroy 50 years of hard work and love. I watched as it reached the crest of the earthen wall. The operator lowered the massive steel blade. The first push tore a gash into the grassy slope, then another and another. Earth and rock stones, Michael and I had set in place with our own hands, tumbled down into the creek bed below. Finally, with a great groan of tearing earth, the main wall breached. The water held back for half a century surged through the gap. It wasn't a flood, it was a release. The calm, clear lake began to drain, pouring downstream. Within minutes, there was nothing left but a wide, deep scar of mud and wet rock. Frogs and small fish flopped in the receding puddles. A profound silence fell, broken only by the gurgle of the last of the water disappearing down the creek. Karen stood with her hands on her hips, beaming with triumph. She looked at me, expecting to see a broken old man. I just lowered my phone, looked her dead in the eye, and said loud enough for her and the deputy to hear, "You can't vote against gravity." 3 weeks after they tore my life's work apart, the silence was the worst part. The lively chatter of birds that used to fill the mornings was gone. The bullfrogs that sang every evening were gone. The little lake my brother Michael and I had created was now a gaping wound of drying, cracking mud. I walked the perimeter of it every day, documenting the changes with my phone. The once damp soil was turning the color of bone, and deep fissures snaked across the empty basin. The small creek that used to trickle gently out of the spillway was now just a dry, rocky ditch. It was a dead place. All that life, all that balance, erased by one woman's vanity and a forged piece of paper. I saved every photo and video to a dedicated hard drive, each file meticulously labeled with the date and time. An engineer keeps good records. It's what we do. While I was documenting the decay, the HOA was celebrating. On the 1st of June, a glossy newsletter appeared in my mailbox. The front page featured a large, smiling picture of Karen Whitfield. She was holding a brand new golden shovel and posing in front of the muddy scar where my dam used to be. The headline read, "Exy eyesore removed, property values protected." I read the article and the bile rose in my throat. She called the project a community beautification initiative. She thanked the board for their courage in taking on a long-neglected safety hazard. She talked about future plans for a scenic walking trail where some stagnant pond had been. It was a masterpiece of propaganda, turning an act of vandalism into a civic triumph. I scanned the newsletter, saved it as a PDF with the date, and filed it away with the other evidence. Her smiling face, that golden shovel, it was receipt drop number 3. I knew I couldn't fight her with anger. I had to fight her with facts. I took a drive down to the County Planning and Development Office. It was a big, soulless building with endless rows of gray filing cabinets and the constant low hum of fluorescent lights. I took a number and waited. When my turn came, I approached the counter and spoke to a young clerk who looked bored out of his mind. I explained that I needed to verify a construction permit. I slid a printed copy of the court order Karen had used with the fuzzy county seal across the counter. "I need to see the original file for this permit number," I said, pointing to the series of digits. The clerk typed the number into his computer. He frowned. He typed it again. He leaned back in his squeaky chair and stared at the screen. "That's weird," he mumbled. "No record of that permit number. Not in the active system. Not in the archives. Are you sure that's the right number?" I looked him straight in the eye. "I'm positive that's the number the HOA president provided." He looked around, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Listen, I'm not supposed to say this, but we've had some issues with that HOA before. Creative paperwork, you know." He tapped the printout with his finger. "A real county permit. The seal is embossed. You can feel it. And that number sequence? It's not our format. Never has been." He looked over his shoulder again, then added in a whisper, "Their permit number doesn't exist." He pushed the paper back toward me. "Officially, I can't help you. There's nothing to find." My heart didn't race. It grew still and cold and heavy, like a piece of iron. This was it. This was the proof. It wasn't just a typo or a mistake. It was fraud, plain and simple. I thanked the clerk, took my useless paper, and walked out. In my truck, I took out a small notebook and wrote down the date, the time, the clerk's general description, and his exact words. Their permit number doesn't exist. That night, the weather forecast changed. The local news channel was buzzing about a major atmospheric river forming over the Pacific, promising a wetter-than-average summer. The meteorologist called it the strongest pattern he'd seen in 15 years. Most people would hear that and think about canceling a barbecue. I heard it and saw the future. I saw the water coming down my hill with nothing to slow it down. I saw the storm runoff that my dam used to tame, now aimed like a fire hose at the back of their million-dollar homes. Vengeance wasn't something I needed to plan. Karen had already done the planning for me. All I had to do was set up the cameras and let nature do the rest. I spent the next 2 days buying and installing 4 weatherproof high-definition time-lapse cameras. I mounted them on old fence posts and trees, aiming them at the Brer Reach in the dam, the barren creek bed, and the sprawling neighborhood below. I set them to record around the clock. The storms were coming, and I was going to have a front row seat. The sky stayed clear for weeks. The sun beat down on the cracked mud of the empty lake bed, baking it as hard as pavement. Karen and the HOA seemed to have won. The neighborhood looked clean, the eyesore was gone, and life went on. But I knew it was just an intermission. I watched the weather reports like a hawk, waiting for the first sign. It finally came on the night of July 8th. The air grew thick and heavy, and a low, distant rumble echoed through the hills. By 11:30 p.m., the first drops began to fall, fat and slow, making dark spots on the dusty ground. I sat in my study, watching from the window. This wasn't just rain. This was the overture. The drizzle quickly turned into a downpour. It was a proper storm, drumming a hard, angry rhythm on my roof. Before the dam, this sound was a comfort, a sign that the lake was filling, that my orchard would be watered. Now it was the sound of a clock ticking. I left the window and went to my computer, pulling up the live feeds from the 4 cameras I had installed. The monitors glowed in the dark room, showing me 4 different angles of the same story. Camera 1 aimed at the Brer Reach showed a muddy trickle turning into a brown torrent, pouring through the man-made gap like it was an open faucet. Camera 2 showed the creek bed below, no longer a gentle stream, but a rushing, churning sluice. The water was moving fast, unimpeded, carrying with it loose dirt and debris. But it was cameras 3 and 4 that held my attention. They were aimed downhill toward the pristine backyards of Oak Ridge Estates. I watched as sheets of water, which used to be held back and released slowly by the dam, now flowed without a pause down the bare slope. The manicured lawns couldn't absorb it fast enough. I saw the water hit the first concrete patio, then the first decorative stone pathway. It followed the path of least resistance, straight toward the back of the homes. On Camera 4's feed, I saw it. The first small victory. The runoff, thick with mud, spilled over a perfectly edged lawn and onto the community sidewalk. It wasn't a flood, not yet, but it was pooling, turning the clean concrete into a shallow, dirty puddle that grew wider with every passing minute. My system had worked. I had clear time-stamped video evidence of exactly what my engineering reports had predicted. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a world that smelled of wet earth and ozone. The flooding on the sidewalks had mostly receded, leaving behind a telltale film of mud. I knew the calls must have already started, and sure enough, around 10, I received an email from the old veteran Gus. He was part of a small, unofficial Neighborhood Watch email list. Attached was an audio file. He wrote, "Frank, thought you'd want to hear this. This was the outgoing message on the HOA emergency hotline this morning." I clicked the file. It was Karen's voice, crisp and annoyed. "For those of you calling about the water," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "it's just summer showers. Nothing to worry about. Please ensure your personal property swales are clear of debris." The message ended with a sharp click. She was brushing them off, blaming them. I saved the 2241 audio file, naming it HA Hotline July 9th MP3. It was receipt drop number 4. A small grim part of me felt a sense of satisfaction. I was right. My warnings were not the ramblings of a bitter old man. They were facts. But that satisfaction was shallow and cold. That afternoon, I walked down to the Brer Reach. The raw, exposed earth was soaked and fragile. This place where my brother and I had laughed and sweated and planned was gone forever. Standing there, I felt a profound sense of loss that overshadowed any feeling of vindication. I hadn't wanted their homes to flood. I wanted my dam back. I wanted the birds and the frogs and the peace of the small lake. I wanted the peace of my brother that lived in those stones. In that moment, I felt utterly powerless. They had already destroyed the thing that mattered most. As I was heading back to the house, a car pulled up my driveway. It was Linda Garvey. She got out and walked toward me, her face etched with worry. "Frank," she said, stopping a few feet away. I wanted to say I'm sorry. You tried to tell us at the meeting. I should have spoken up more." She looked past me at the muddy wreckage. My husband was up all night checking the basement. We had water seeping in for the first time ever. She finally met my eyes. thank you for trying to warn us." Her words were simple, but they landed with surprising weight. It was the first time someone from that side of the property line had acknowledged the truth. It was a small crack in Karen's wall of lies. That night, as I was archiving the day's footage, I left the television on. The local news was on, and the weatherman stood in front of a giant, angry-looking map covered in swirling colors. "Folks, if you thought last night was something, you better get your rain boots ready," he said, pointing a remote at the screen. This was just the opening act. We're tracking a system that has all the markings of the rainiest season this region has seen in 15 years. I looked from the map on the screen to the hard drive on my desk filled with video files. The first test was over. The real exam was about to begin. By week 6, the word swamp was no longer a joke. It was a reality. The predicted rainy season had arrived, not with one big storm, but with a relentless, punishing pattern of steady rain almost every other day. The ground in Oak Ridge Estates never had a chance to dry. It became saturated, then supersaturated, until it could not absorb another drop. The water, with nowhere else to go, just sat there. I didn't need to check my cameras to know what was happening, but I did. Every single morning, I'd archive the previous day's footage. The time lapses were damning. They showed the gradual, creeping takeover of the land. The neat green lawns at the bottom of my hill turned into squelching, muddy fields. Then the fields turned into shallow pools of standing water. And then the pools began to grow things. On August 2021, I took a walk to the edge of my property where the view overlooked their cul-de-sac. The timestamp on my phone's camera read 9:45 a.m. From my vantage point, I could see it clearly. A slimy, bright green film of algae was spreading across the surface of the new unwanted water features in their backyards. The most expensive house on the block, a sprawling 1.2 million show home with a pudding green and a rose garden, now sat in the middle of a stagnant, shallow swamp. The roses were drowned, and the pudding green was submerged under 3 in of murky water. The air carried a new smell, the musty, decaying odor of a bog. It was the smell of Karen's victory, rotting from the inside out. I snapped a series of high-resolution photos, evidence of the exact outcome the engineering reports had warned against. My records were growing more detailed, more undeniable by the day. The residents, as expected, were panicking. The HOA message boards, which I monitored through a public portal, were on fire with complaints. People were posting pictures of flooded crawl spaces, ruined flower beds, and driveways that looked like boat launches. They were angry, and they were scared. Karen's response was predictable. An official email blast went out to the entire community. I received a copy through my anonymous tipster. It was a masterclass in shifting blame. Residents are reminded. It read in a bold, condescending font that, per the community bylaws, it is your personal responsibility to maintain drainage, swales, and French drains on your property. The association is not responsible for acts of nature. She was calling the flood she created an act of nature and telling the victims it was their fault. That email was the breaking point. The next HOA meeting was not the polite, sleepy affair it usually was. It was a mutiny. I didn't attend, but Gus, my veteran neighbor, gave me a full report later that night. He said the clubhouse was packed, standing room only. People who never came to meetings were there. And they were furious. One man, a lawyer who lived in the half-submerged show home, stood up and yelled directly at Karen, "My property value has dropped by $250,000 in the last month because you turned our street into a wetland. You destroyed the one thing that kept us dry." Others joined in, shouting about mold, mosquitoes, and sinking foundations. For the first time, Karen Whitfield had lost control of the room. Others joined in, shouting about mold, mosquitoes, and sinking foundations. For the first time, Karen Whitfield had lost control of the room. She was being attacked by the very people she claimed to be protecting. But a cornered animal is a dangerous one. Instead of admitting fault or offering a solution, Karen doubled down. She grabbed the microphone, her face a mask of outrage. "This is not the association's fault," she shrieked. "This is sabotage." She then pointed a trembling finger in the general direction of my property. "Frank Delaney is angry that we removed his ugly illegal structure. He has been seen on his property near the drainage channels. He is clearly blocking the storm drains to make us look bad." The accusation was so absurd, so desperate. It was almost laughable. But she said it with such conviction that it planted a seed of doubt in some of the more gullible residents. She was turning her failure into a conspiracy, with me as the villain. The meeting descended into chaos, and Karen, seeing her chance, seized it. She declared the problem was a police matter and stormed out. I knew what was coming next. Less than an hour later, I saw the flashing lights, red and blue strobed across my living room walls. I went to the front door and looked out. Deputy Rick Nolan's patrol car was parked at my gate, its lights painting the trees in frantic bursts of color. He just sat there, not getting out, not doing anything. It was a pure act of intimidation. Karen couldn't win on the facts, so she was sending her paid enforcer to harass me, to make me look guilty in front of the whole neighborhood. I stood there in my own doorway, watching the empty display of power, and a cold thought settled in my mind. They won't just let me win. They'll try to bury me with lies and bogus accusations before they ever admit they were wrong. The fight was no longer just about a dam. It was about the truth, and I was beginning to realize how far they would go to keep it buried. The night Deputy Nolan parked his cruiser at my gate was a turning point. Karen's stunt wasn't just a threat, it was a gift. It proved she was no longer just arrogant. She was desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. The next morning, I decided it was time to stop gathering evidence and start assembling it into a weapon. I cleared off my big kitchen table, the one my late wife and I used to use for family dinners, and turned it into a war room. I laid out every piece of the puzzle I had collected over the last 5 months. The certified letter, my original property survey, the printed screenshots of the HOA meeting minutes where Linda Garvey first voiced her support, my time-stamped emails with the engineering reports ignored by the board, the glossy newsletter with Karen and her golden shovel, the audio file of her dismissing the first flood warnings. It was a timeline of arrogance and incompetence laid bare in chronological order, but the centerpiece of my collection, the 3215 key that would unlock the whole case, was the permit. I had been back to the county office, this time to the public 3222 records department, and requested a sample copy of a standard demolition permit from the previous year. I didn't mention the HOA or Karen. I just said it was for a personal research project. The clerk, a helpful older woman, printed one out for me without a second thought. Now, I placed it on the table next to the scanned copy of Karen's fuzzy document. Side by side, the fraud was laughably obvious. The real permit had a crisp, clear county seal. In the top left corner, under a magnifying glass, you could see a faint watermark, a tiny eagle embedded in the paper. Karen's permit had a blurry, pixelated blob where the seal should be, and no watermark at all. The fonts were different. The layout was wrong. It was a forgery, and a clumsy one at that. This was my smoking gun. Receipt drop number 5. I knew I needed a second opinion, an expert who could explain the technical side in a way that anyone could understand. I called my oldest friend, Earl Jackson. Earl and I came up together in the engineering world. He was retired like me, after a long career as a civil engineer specializing in hydraulics. An hour later, he was at my kitchen table, a glass of bourbon in his hand, looking over my evidence. He picked up the 2 permits and chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Frank, this 3350C6 is an insult to forgers everywhere," he said, pointing a thick finger at Karen's document. "My grandson could do a better job on his school computer." He then spent the next hour walking me through my own evidence, translating the technical data from the old engineering reports into plain English. "Look here," he said, tapping a graph showing water flow rates. "This isn't complicated. A dam isn't ugly. It's hydraulic insurance. It's a machine designed to slow down energy. You take it away, and that energy, the water, has to go somewhere. It's physics." Karen didn't just knock down a pile of rocks. She aimed a loaded gun at her own neighborhood and pulled the trigger. He agreed to go on the record to put his name and his credentials behind that statement. I had the proof. I had the expert. Now I needed an audience bigger than the HOA board. I needed to take the story out of the clubhouse and put it in front of the whole town. I spent the afternoon researching local news reporters. I wasn't looking for a flashy news anchor. I was looking for a digger, someone with a reputation for sniffing out inconvenient truths. I found him in Mark Reynolds, an investigative reporter for the local Channel 8 News. His profile said he specialized in consumer protection and government accountability. I packed a thumb drive with copies of everything: the videos, the audio, the photos, the forged permit next to the real one. I wrote a simple one-page summary with a clear timeline. Then I drove to the TV station and left the package with the front desk addressed to him personally. I didn't have to wait long. Mark Reynolds called me the next morning. His voice was sharp, professional, and full of questions. He was hooked. He spent the next week doing his own digging, verifying everything I had given him. He interviewed Earl. He spoke to Linda Garvey and some of the other flooded-out homeowners. He even went down to the county office himself and confirmed that the permit number was fictitious. The pieces were all falling into place. The broadcast was scheduled for September 14th at 6 p.m. on the dot. I sat in my armchair watching the local news. The story was the lead segment after the first commercial break. The opening shot was stunning. A drone flying over Oakage Estates showing the shimmering green water where pristine lawns used to be. Mark Reynolds' voice came on calm and authoritative. A neighborhood flooded, a community in crisis. Tonight, we investigate how one HOA's decision to demolish a protective dam led to a suburban disaster. The report laid out the whole story piece by piece using my documents, my videos. They showed the side-by-side permit comparison. They aired a clip of Earl explaining, "You can't vote against gravity." The final scene of the segment was Mark Reynolds catching Karen in the parking lot of the HOA office. He held a microphone out to her. "Miss Whitfield, can you comment on the allegations that you used a fraudulent county permit to demolish the dam?" The camera zoomed in on Karen's face. It was a mask of pure panic. She didn't say a word. She just shielded her face with her purse, skewered to her luxury SUV, and slammed the door. The image of that car door slamming was the most satisfying thing I'd seen in months. The truth was out, and it was just the beginning. The Channel 8 news story was like throwing a match on a pile of gasoline-soaked rags. The explosion was immediate. The HOA was hammered with calls and emails. The county planning office, now officially implicated, launched its own internal investigation into the fraudulent permit. But the final act of this drama wasn't written by a news reporter or a county bureaucrat. It was written by the sky. In early October, the granddaddy of all the storms that season rolled in from the coast. This wasn't just rain, it was a deluge. A solid wall of water that fell for 12 straight hours without a break. My cameras, which I had kept running, captured the inevitable and catastrophic conclusion. The muddy creek that ran through the demolished dam became a brown, raging river. It surged downhill with the force of a battering ram and hit the bottom of the cul-de-sac. This time, the water didn't just pool on the sidewalks. It swamped entire backyards, submerged cars up to their door handles, and poured into the million-dollar homes through their basement windows and back doors. The entire cul-de-sac was under waist-deep water. It was no longer a swamp. It was a disaster zone. By morning, the neighborhood was crawling with official vehicles. There were massive pumper trucks from the fire department, vans from 3 different television news stations, and a fleet of cars from insurance companies, their adjusters walking around in rubber boots with clipboards, their faces grim. County officials were there too, their expressions a mixture of fury and embarrassment. The story was no longer about a petty HOA dispute. It was a full-blown municipal emergency. Broadcast on the morning news, I watched from my property line as a county administrator, flanked by 2 sheriff's deputies, walked up to the HOA clubhouse and tacked a large, bright orange sign to the front door. I zoomed in with my phone's camera. The words were big and black and beautiful. Notice of violation. By order of the County Commission, all operations of the Oakage Estates Homeowners Association are to cease and desist, pending a full investigation into permit fraud and willful negligence. That orange sign was the final receipt. It was the tombstone for Karen Whitfield's little empire. That evening, an emergency town hall was called, held not in the tiny clubhouse, but in the high school gymnasium to accommodate the entire furious neighborhood. The place was packed. The air crackled with anger. I sat in the back row with my friend Earl. I didn't need to say a word. My work was done. Karen stood at the front behind a podium looking pale and small. She tried to speak to offer excuses about the unprecedented rainfall, but the residents shouted her down. They were done with her lies. As the chaos reached a fever pitch, the main doors of the gymnasium swung open. The county sheriff walked in, followed by 2 of his deputies. He didn't look at the crowd. He walked straight toward the podium. He walked right up to Karen Whitfield. The room fell silent. Karen Whitfield, the sheriff said, his voice booming through the gym without a microphone. "You are under arrest for felony document forgery and reckless endangerment." Karen's jaw dropped. She started to sputter a protest, but the sheriff simply took her by the arm. One of the deputies stepped behind her and in one smooth motion pulled her hands behind her back. Then came the sound. The most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The sharp, clean, metallic click of handcuffs closing around her wrists. For a second, there was stunned silence. Then one person started clapping, then another and another until the entire gymnasium erupted in applause. The residents who she had bullied and lied to were giving her a standing ovation as she was led away in shame. After she was gone, the county commissioner addressed the crowd, promising a full investigation and assistance for the homeowners. As people began to file out, a few of them stopped by my chair. Linda Garvey, the old veteran Gus, even the lawyer from the flooded show home. They didn't say much. A nod, a handshake, a quiet, "Thank you, Frank," that was enough. The county supervisor approached me before I left. He apologized for the county's oversight and assured me that things would be made right. I looked at him and at all the faces in the room, and I said the only thing that needed to be said. "I warned you," I said, my voice steady and clear. The dam was ugly only to pride, not to nature. In the months that followed, justice like water followed its course. The HOA was forced into receivership. A new temporary board was appointed by the county, made up of engineers and accountants, tasked with cleaning up the financial and physical mess. They immediately approved a settlement with me using the HOA's insurance policy to pay for the complete reconstruction of the dam and for damages to my property. The most remarkable thing, however, happened when the construction crew arrived. Gus showed up with a shovel. So did Linda Garvey's husband. Soon, a dozen neighbors were there, not to protest, but to help. They hauled rocks, spread soil, and planted native grasses alongside my crew. Together, we rebuilt what one person's arrogance had torn down. A few weeks ago, the new dam was finished, stronger and better than before. The spring rains have come and the small lake is slowly filling again. The birds are coming back. The other day, I saw a group of neighborhood kids skipping stones across the rising water. I stood there watching them, feeling the quiet, steady peace of a promise kept. You can fight your neighbors, you can forge documents, you can even bully people into silence for a while. But you can't vote against gravity. Subscribe for more HOA stories in English, real experiences, drama, and lessons from HOA life.